Since the 1st century, a sequence of 3 digits has traversed history like no other: 666. It has been tattooed in films, emblazoned in conspiracy theories, and whispered with fear in churches around the world. But what almost no one realizes is that the Apostle John never wrote this number as a warning about a code. He described a system, a mechanism of control so sophisticated that it would operate over buying, selling, worship, and identity. And, most disturbingly, it may already be functioning. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. To understand what John truly saw, you must first understand where he was when he saw it. We are around the year 95 after Christ. The Roman Emperor is Domitian, a ruler who demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Christianity, which by this time has existed for about 60 years since the resurrection, is no longer an invisible sect within Judaism. It is a movement that has spread through at least 40 Roman provinces, with organized communities in cities such as Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. 7 cities, 7 churches, and all of them are under a pressure that goes far beyond physical persecution. John is imprisoned on the island of Patmos, a rock of approximately 34 square kilometers in the middle of the Aegean Sea, used by Rome as a penal colony. Consider the setting. An elderly man, probably over 80 years old, exiled on an arid island, separated from all the communities he helped found. He has no access to unlimited scrolls, he has no library, he has no comfort. What he has is a vision. And this vision will become the last book of the Scriptures, the Apocalypse. The word apocalypse does not mean destruction. It means revelation, unveiling. It is the act of pulling back the veil. And what John reveals is not merely a sequence of future catastrophes, it is the internal mechanics of how power organizes itself against God and against the human being. He sees beasts, seals, trumpets, bowls, but at the center of it all, he sees something that no prophet before him described with such precision: an economic religious system of total control. Revelation, chapter 13. This is where everything changes. John describes 2 beasts. The first rises from the sea. It has 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon the horns 10 diadems. It receives authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. This first beast represents political power, a global, structured, organized dominion, but it does not act alone. A second beast rises from the earth. This one has 2 horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. Observe the detail. It appears gentle, it appears religious, it appears good, but the voice that comes out of it is that of the dragon. This second beast is the ideological apparatus, the system of spiritual legitimation that makes the whole world worship the first. And it is this second beast that introduces the mark. Verses 16 and 17 of Revelation 13. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Read it again slowly. It is not a random number. It is a mark linked to a name, and this mark functions as an access key. Without it, you are out of commerce, out of the economy, out of social life. The text does not describe a mystical tattoo or an isolated futuristic chip. It describes a mechanism, a gear with 3 components: identification, authorization, and exclusion. Identification: you receive a mark that links you to the system. Authorization: only with this mark can you participate in economic life. Exclusion: without it, you are cut off from everything. This is a system. And here enters the part that most people completely ignore. Verse 18 says, Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. John is not saying be afraid of this number. He is saying use wisdom to understand what this number represents. The Greek word used is psephizato, which means to calculate, to account, to reason. It is a word of logic, not of terror. John is asking for discernment, not panic. But why 666? To answer this, you need to understand a resource called gematria. In antiquity, both Hebrew and Greek had no separate symbols for numbers. The letters themselves functioned as numerals. Each letter had a numerical value. Therefore, every name could be converted into a sum, and this sum functioned almost like a mathematical signature. When John writes 666, his first-century readers would immediately understand that he is pointing to a specific name. And the name that most consistently sums to 666 in Hebrew gematria is Neron Caesar, Nero Caesar, Nero, the emperor who set fire to Rome in the year 64 and blamed the Christians, the man who covered believers in pitch and used them as human torches to light his gardens on the Palatine Hill, turning human beings into living candelabras for his nightly parties. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded that Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs to be torn apart, while crowds watched in the Circus of Nero, an arena that held more than 20,000 spectators. The ruler who beheaded Paul on the Via Ostiense, and according to the tradition preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea, crucified Peter upside down on the Vatican Hill. Nero was not just a tyrant. He was the incarnation of political power, using religious violence as a tool of control. His reign lasted 14 years from the year 54 to 68, and in that period he demonstrated with brutal clarity how a system can function. First, create an enemy. Then, offer security in exchange for conformity. And finally, eliminate those who do not conform. But here is the point that changes everything. John is not just talking about Nero. Nero was already dead when the Apocalypse was written. It had been nearly 30 years since Nero had committed suicide in the year 68. So why would John use his name? Because Nero was the prototype, the model, the first complete manifestation of that which would repeat throughout history. John is saying, the system that Nero represented did not die with him. It will return, it will reorganize, it will adapt, and it will demand the same thing again, total worship in exchange for participation in society. Consider the sophistication of this. In the 1st century, Rome already operated exactly like this. The imperial cult was not just religion, it was economics. In cities like Ephesus and Smyrna, the trade guilds, associations of craftsmen, merchants, weavers, blacksmiths, demanded participation in pagan rituals as a condition for work. If you were a Christian carpenter in Ephesus and refused to burn incense before the statue of the emperor, you were not just excluded from the temple, you were excluded from the guild, and without the guild you could not sell your products, you could not buy raw materials, you could not participate in the trade fairs. Your family starved. This is not theory. It is documented history. Archaeological records from the 7 cities of Asia Minor show that there were at least 26 different trade guilds operating in Ephesus in the 1st century. Each of them held ceremonial banquets in honor of pagan deities or the emperor. Participation was not optional. It was the price of entry into the market. Now scale this. You are a 1st century Christian. You have a wife, 3 children. You work as a weaver. Your entire livelihood depends on selling fabric in the city markets. And the guild demands that you participate in a banquet where meat sacrificed to idols is offered and a libation is made to the emperor as a divine being. If you participate, you compromise your faith. If you do not participate, your children do not eat. That is the system. That is the real choice, not theoretical, not future, present and visceral. Historians estimate that between 60 and 80% of urban economic activity in the cities of Asia Minor was linked in some way to the guilds and their rituals. A Christian who refused to participate did not just lose a job. He lost his entire network. Suppliers stopped selling raw materials. Neighbors began to grow suspicious. Economic exclusion became social exclusion, and social exclusion eventually became denunciation to the authorities. It is not a barcode, it is not a microchip, it is a structure that uses economic access as currency for spiritual loyalty. And John from Patmos looks at this mechanism and says, This will not stop here. This will grow. The 7 letters that open the Apocalypse, chapters 2 and 3, already make this clear. To the church in Pergamum, John writes that it dwells where Satan's seat is. Pergamum housed the largest altar to Zeus in all of Asia Minor, a structure over 35 meters wide, with carved friezes extending 120 meters in length. But the problem was not the altar itself. It was that around it revolved the entire civic and economic life of the city. Religion and commerce were fused. To the church in Thyatira, John mentions a woman he calls Jezebel, likely a local prophetess who taught that it was acceptable to participate in the guild banquets without compromising the faith. She offered a shortcut, a way to maintain a Christian conscience while not losing access to the market. John condemns this radically, because he understands that the issue was never just about food or ritual. The issue is about to whom you owe loyalty, and that is the heart of the 666. In the Bible, the number 7 represents divine completeness, perfection. God rested on the 7th day. There are 7 spirits before the throne, 7 churches, 7 seals. 6, on the other hand, is the number that falls short. It is incompleteness, the human attempt to reach the divine without God. 666 is 6 repeated 3 times, like a false trinity. The dragon imitating the Father, the first beast imitating the Son, the second beast imitating the Holy Spirit. An entire structure built to look divine, function as divine, demand worship as divine, but which is, in its essence, a counterfeit. How is it possible that a system described nearly 2,000 years ago seems to describe mechanisms that we are only now beginning to fully comprehend? Look at the mechanics described in Revelation 13. First, there is a centralized political power with global reach, authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. Then, there is an ideological apparatus that makes people voluntarily worship this power, the second beast that causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast. Next, there is a universal identification mark linked to economic access. And finally, there is total exclusion for those who do not participate. 4 layers: political power, ideological legitimation, economic identification, social exclusion. In the 1st century, this functioned through guilds and the imperial cult. But John saw beyond the 1st century. He saw the principle repeating itself, and each repetition brought more sophistication. In the 3rd century, when the Emperor Decius published his edict in the year 250, he demanded that all citizens of the empire perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate called a libellus. Without this document, you were considered a criminal. You could not access courts, markets, or public services. The libellus was, in practice, an authorization of civil existence conditioned on religious conformity. Sound familiar? Thousands of Christians faced the choice. Some sacrificed and obtained the certificate. Others paid bribes to obtain false certificates without performing the sacrifice, the so-called libellatici. Others refused completely and were imprisoned, tortured, executed. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, documented the crisis this generated within the church itself. Entire communities were divided between those who yielded and those who resisted. Families were destroyed, not by the sword, but by economic and social pressure. The system did not need to kill everyone, it was enough to exclude them. Fast forward a few centuries. In the Middle Ages, papal excommunication functioned in a similar way. An excommunicated king did not just lose access to the sacraments. He lost political alliances, trade treaties, and the loyalty of vassals. When Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV in the year 1076, Henry was forced to walk barefoot through the snow to the castle of Canossa and wait for 3 days to beg for forgiveness. One of the most powerful men in Europe, on his knees, not because someone raised a sword against him, but because the religious system controlled access to the political and economic system. The mark changes form, the system remains. Now observe something John does in the text that almost no one comments on. He specifies that the mark is placed in their right hand or in their foreheads. In biblical tradition, the hand represents action, what you do. The forehead represents thought, what you believe. The mark of the system does not demand only external obedience. It demands internal adherence. Either you act according to it, or you think according to it. Ideally, both. This is not a linguistic coincidence. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 to 8, Moses instructs Israel regarding the commandments of God. "And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes." Hand and forehead, action and thought. God asked that his law be in these two places. The beast places its mark in exactly the same places, a deliberate imitation. The system described in the Apocalypse does not invent a new form of control. It hijacks the form that God had already established and inverts it. Where God asks for faith, the system demands conformity. Where God offers freedom, the system imposes dependence. Where God invites, the system compels. And that is exactly what makes the system so dangerous. It does not present itself as an enemy. It presents itself as a necessity. Return to the text of Revelation 13. The second beast, the one that looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon, performs great signs. It makes fire come down from heaven. It deceives those who dwell on the earth, and it commands that an image of the first beast be made, and that this image receive breath so that it might speak. An image that speaks. In the first century, this seemed impossible. It was the language of vision, of symbol. But the principle is clear. The system creates representations of itself that seem to have a life of their own. Structures, institutions, narratives that self-perpetuate and demand worship. When the Apocalypse says that he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, it is describing something that transcends any specific technology. It is describing the capacity of the system to create a presence that seems alive, that seems autonomous, that seems inevitable. And before this presence, the text says, "Whoever does not worship it shall be killed." Literal death or social death. Total exclusion. The first Christians understood this in their flesh. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia around the year 112, wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan describing how he dealt with Christians. He interrogated them 3 times. If they persisted in their confession, he ordered them executed. But before that, he offered a way out. It was enough to curse Christ and offer incense to the statue of the emperor. Those who did this were released. Pliny reports that some made the offering immediately, others hesitated, and others preferred to die. The cost was real. It was not abstract theology. It was blood. Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, one of the 7 churches of the Apocalypse, was martyred around the year 155. He was 86 years old. When the Roman proconsul demanded that he swear by the genius of Caesar and curse Christ, Polycarp replied, 86 years have I served Christ, and he hath never done me wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king, who hath saved me? He was burned alive. A man of nearly 90 years, firm before a system that offered life in exchange for loyalty. He chose the stake. This is what it means to refuse the mark. But the Apocalypse does not only tell the story of the beast, and this is a point that is lost amidst the fascination with 666. In chapter 14, immediately after describing the mark, John sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had the Father's name written on their foreheads, another mark, another seal, but this one not bought, not imposed, not conditioned on economic participation. This one is given by belonging. 2. Systems operating at the same time, one based on control, another based on covenant, one that needs to force worship, another that receives it freely. And John places the 2 side by side on purpose, because the choice between them is the axis of the entire narrative of the Apocalypse. Chapter 14 continues with 3 angels. The first proclaims the eternal gospel. The second announces the fall of Babylon, the economic religious system in its final form. And the third gives the most severe warning in all of Scripture. If any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. The language is of eternal consequence, not for someone who used the wrong card or received a random number, but for someone who surrendered their worship, their deepest loyalty, to the system that opposes God. Worship. That is the key word that runs through the entire Apocalypse. It appears more than 20 times in the book. Whom do you worship? To whom do you attribute supreme value? On whom do you depend for security, identity, belonging? 666 is not a number to fear. It is a question to answer. Because the system does not ask you to hate God, it asks you to simply need something else more than God. And what John saw in the end is that this tension is not resolved with information. It is resolved with decision. Revelation chapter 18 describes the fall of Babylon with an impressive list of merchandise: gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, wood, ivory, brass, iron, marble, cinnamon, spices, incense, ointments, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, beasts, sheep, horses, chariots, and finally, slaves and souls of men. The list begins with luxury and ends with people. It is the complete X-ray of a system that turns everything into merchandise, including human beings, including the soul. 28 items listed. And the order is not random. It goes from the most precious materially to the most precious spiritually, showing that the system consumes everything. Nothing escapes its logic of buying and selling. Nothing is sacred enough not to have a price. And when this system falls, because John guarantees that it falls, who weeps? The kings who grew rich with her, the merchants who sold their merchandise, the shipmasters who transported her. Riches. They weep not because they lost the truth, but because they lost the profit. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, says the text. In 1 hour. Meanwhile, heaven celebrates. Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. The fall of the system is the day of justice for all who were excluded, marginalized, martyred for refusing to participate. For Polycarp, for the Christians of Nero, for every weaver who lost his guild, every family that went hungry, every believer who chose faithfulness instead of survival. The apocalypse does not end with destruction. It ends with a city. Revelation 21 describes the New Jerusalem descending from heaven with 12 gates, each made of a single pearl, and streets of pure gold, transparent as glass. The city has extraordinary dimensions, 12,000 stadia in length, breadth and height, something like 2,200 kilometers in each direction. It is an image of perfection, abundance, and total access. Because in this city, the text says, the gates shall not be shut at all, never. There is no exclusion. There is no access mark. There is no filtering system. The tree of life yields 12 manner of fruits, one for each month, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. Everything the system of the beast promised, security, prosperity, belonging, the city of God offers for real, without cost, without condition of conformity, without exchange of loyalty. That is why 666 is not just a number, it is the description of everything that tries to replace what only God can offer. It is the perpetual attempt to build a total human system that functions as God, that controls, that provides, that demands worship, and that marginalizes anyone who seeks their security elsewhere. John wrote the Apocalypse for churches that were living this in real time, not in a distant future, in their present, real believers, in real cities, facing real consequences for refusing to bow the knee before a system that offered everything except the truth. The letters to the 7 churches show that not all resisted in the same way. Laodicea was lukewarm, Smyrna was poor but faithful, Philadelphia had little strength but kept the word. Each community faced the system with the resources it had, and John's message was the same for all. Resist, not out of heroism, but out of clarity, because the system will seem necessary, it will seem reasonable, it will seem inevitable, but it has an expiration date, and the Lamb does not. The system John described never depended on technology. It depended on something much older, the human willingness to trade freedom for comfort, conviction for convenience, true worship for temporary security. Each generation has faced its own version of this trade, and perhaps the question the apocalypse truly asks is not, when will this happen, but would you be able to recognize it when it is already happening? Because the system does not announce itself, it installs itself silently. And he who has ears, let him hear.